Most people who have ever tasted this vegetable believe the same story about it. They believe it is a Chinese invention, or an Indian one. Something bred and perfected in an ancient Asian kitchen, shaped over centuries by farmers chasing flavor, then handed down as folk medicine. That story feels right. This vegetable is everywhere in Chinese stir-fries, in Indian curries, in Filipino home cooking, in Okinawan longevity diets. Its warty green skin and famously punishing bitterness feel like something only an old, deeply rooted Asian food culture could have produced. But that story, as neat as it sounds, is not entirely true. The real beginning of this plant is much older, and it starts on a completely different continent. It also involves an active scientific argument that is still playing out in research journals right now over exactly where and when this vegetable became the crop people cook with today. To find it, we have to rewind the clock by thousands of years and move the map from Asia all the way to southern Africa. The story of bitter melon starts in Africa. Genetic research on the plant, including work published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, traces the deepest wild ancestry of this species back to African soil, where dozens of closely related wild species still grow today. Long before it was ever a farmed crop, it was simply a wild tendril-bearing vine scattered across parts of the continent, climbing over shrubs and fences the same way it still does today. In the Kalahari Desert, sand peoples, sometimes referred to in the scientific literature as the Ikung, gathered the wild fruit as a reliable dry season food. When rain failed and other plants withered, this small, bitter, warty gourd was something people could count on. It was not glamorous. It was not sweet. It was survival food, gathered from the wild, with no formal cultivation, no selective breeding, and no written record of its use beyond what archaeologists and botanists have pieced together much later. For an unknown stretch of prehistory, that is all this plant was, a resilient wild vine that helped keep hunter-gatherer communities fed through the hardest part of the year. The wild African relatives of this plant remain remarkably diverse today. Botanists studying the wider Momordica genus have identified dozens of related wild species scattered across the continent, most of them found nowhere else on Earth. That density of wild relatives is itself one of the strongest pieces of evidence pointing toward Africa as the plant's original home, since a species typically shows its greatest genetic diversity closest to the region where it first evolved. At some point, seeds or plant material from this African vine made their way east into Asia. Exactly how and when that migration happened is not fully settled, and researchers openly admit as much. What is clear is that once the plant arrived in Asia, something changed. People there began to deliberately grow it, select it, and shape it into something closer to the vegetable we recognize today. A long-read genome study of bitter gourd published in 2020 estimated that full domestication took place roughly 6,000 years ago, based on that team's genetic analysis, though this figure should be understood as a scientific estimate rather than a fixed, agreed-upon date. The same study proposed that a later split into today's distinct cultivated varieties happened around 800 years ago. Not everyone in the scientific community agrees on the details. A separate research team, publishing in the same journal, argued instead that domestication may have begun in Asia using wild populations that closely resemble their African relatives, rather than through a direct migration event from Africa. The two teams have gone back and forth in print, each questioning the other's sampling and conclusions. This is not a minor footnote. It is an active, ongoing scientific disagreement about a vegetable that most people assume has a simple, uncontested origin story. What both sides of that debate do agree on is this: by the time recorded history begins, bitter melon is already deeply woven into life on the Indian subcontinent. Genomic research on cultivated bitter gourd points to written Sanskrit records of the plant dating back to the Indo-Aryan period, broadly placed between 2,000 and 200 years before the Common Era. That means bitter melon was already a known, named, and presumably cultivated plant in South Asia thousands of years ago, tied into some of the earliest layers of Indian medical and culinary thought. Centuries later, in the 17th century, a smaller fruited wild variety of the plant was formally documented by the botanist Willdenow in the Hortus Malabaricus, an influential early work cataloging the plants of the Malabar coast of India. Long before modern nutrition science existed, healers across the Indian subcontinent were already treating this vegetable as something more than ordinary food. Its intense bitterness was not seen as a flaw to be bred out. It was seen as the entire point. In many traditional systems of medicine across South Asia, a bitter taste was itself treated as a therapeutic signal, a sign that a plant was actively doing something to the body, whether cooling internal heat, aiding digestion, or clearing the blood well beyond simple nourishment. In Ayurvedic practice, bitterness was classified as one of 6 recognized tastes, each linked to particular effects on the body, and bitter melon was placed firmly among the foods believed to detoxify and balance the system. That belief did not stay confined to religious or scholarly texts. It shaped everyday cooking, showing up in home remedies for fevers, skin complaints, and digestive trouble that were passed down verbally through families long before anyone wrote them into a formal medical record. From South Asia, the plant kept moving east. According to horticultural historians, bitter melon reached China by around the 14th century, arriving through the trade and travel networks that had long connected South Asia and East Asia. Once it landed in China, it found one of its most important champions. In the late Ming dynasty, a physician, herbalist, and naturalist named Shizhen spent 27 years compiling an enormous pharmacological work known as the Bencao Gangmu, translated into English as the Compendium of Materia Medica. Li completed his first draft of the work in 1578, and it was eventually printed in Nanjing in 1596, 3 years after his death in 1593. The finished compendium catalogued more than 1,800 substances used in traditional Chinese medicine, drawing on hundreds of earlier texts as well as Li's own extensive travels, fieldwork, and first-hand clinical observations. Inside that massive work, bitter melon earned genuine praise. Li described it as bitter in taste and non-toxic, credited with expelling what traditional medicine called evil heat, relieving fatigue and even improving vision. For a medical culture that already prized food as medicine, having bitter melon formally recorded inside the most influential materia medica in Chinese history helped cement its place in Chinese kitchens and apothecaries for the centuries that followed. The compendium itself went on to travel even further, reportedly reaching Japan by the 17th century, carrying bitter melon's reputation along with it into yet another medical tradition. Bitter melon did not stop moving once it reached East Asia. It kept spreading outward through trade, migration, and eventually colonial-era plant exchange, taking on new names and new preparations in nearly every place it landed. In parts of India, it is often sliced thin, marinated with salt and tamarind, then fried with spices and served alongside something sweet like yogurt to soften the bitterness on the tongue. In China, it commonly appears in stir-fries with garlic, egg, pork, or fermented black soybeans, and historical accounts note it was even used at times as a bittering agent in place of hops in certain regional beers in China and Japan. In the Philippines, it is called ampalaya and is treated almost as a national vegetable, stir-fried with egg or simmered into stews. In Okinawa, where it is called Goya, it became so central to local cuisine that it is now closely tied to the region's reputation for unusually long lifespans, appearing constantly in the local diet. The plant eventually reached the Caribbean as well, most likely carried along overlapping African and Asian trade and migration routes over the centuries, although the exact timeline of its arrival there is not as precisely documented as its path through Asia. In Jamaica, it became known as cerasee, brewed into a strong, bitter tea that is treated as a traditional home remedy for digestion and general cleansing, still passed down informally from one generation to the next. In Trinidad and Tobago, it is called karaili, and it is typically fried rather than brewed. By the 20th century, bitter melon had also reached the mainland United States, arriving in states like Florida largely through Asian immigrant farming communities who continued growing and cooking it much as they had at home, gradually introducing it to a much wider American audience. Archival photographs from Florida in the 1950s show immigrant farmers already cultivating bitter melon alongside other Chinese vegetables, evidence that the plant had put down roots in American soil well before it became a familiar item in mainstream grocery stores decades later. Which brings us to the part of this story that gets exaggerated the most today. Bitter melon's centuries-old reputation as a healer did not fade with time. If anything, in the modern era it grew louder, especially around one very specific and very commercially convenient claim that bitter melon can treat, manage, or even cure diabetes. Walk through almost any health food store or search online for a few minutes, and you will find bitter melon capsules, powders, extracts, and teas marketed with confident promises about controlling blood sugar. The truth, based on the actual clinical research, is considerably messier than the marketing suggests. Some individual studies do report real, measurable effects. A 12-week randomized, placebo-controlled trial conducted in Korea with participants who had prediabetes found that a bitter melon extract lowered blood glucose levels measured during an oral glucose tolerance test, an effect the researchers linked to a drop in glucagon levels after treatment. Another randomized, placebo-controlled trial in patients already diagnosed with type 2 diabetes reported improved fasting glucose and reduced insulin resistance after 12 weeks of regular bitter melon intake. A separate study using a specially processed bitter melon peptide followed 142 diabetic patients and found a modest but statistically significant drop in long-term blood sugar markers in the treatment group compared to controls. But when researchers stepped back and looked at the full body of evidence together, rather than at any single favorable study, the picture changed considerably. A systematic review and meta-analysis published in the journal Frontiers in Nutrition combined data from 9 randomized controlled trials covering a total of 414 patients, followed for periods ranging from 4 to 16 weeks. Across that combined data, bitter melon showed no statistically significant advantage over placebo for fasting blood glucose, for longer-term blood sugar control measured through hemoglobin A1C, or for markers like cholesterol and blood pressure. The authors of that review concluded plainly that, based on the currently available clinical evidence, the true metabolic effect of Momordica carrantia simply cannot be determined. Part of the problem, according to the researchers, is that studies have used wildly different forms of the plant, different doses, different growing regions, and different lengths of treatment, making it hard to compare one trial against another in any meaningful way. A vegetable eaten fresh in a stir-fry is simply not the same intervention as a standardized capsule extract tested in a laboratory, even though marketing often blurs that distinction completely. Earlier independent reviews published in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology and later in the British Journal of Nutrition reached similarly cautious conclusions, noting that existing trials were often too small, too short, too inconsistently designed, or used too many different preparations of the plant to prove a reliable, repeatable benefit. None of this means bitter melon does nothing at all for blood sugar. It means the simple, confident claim, repeated endlessly in wellness marketing, that this vegetable is a proven natural cure for diabetes is not something the current body of science actually supports. Some early laboratory research has also explored whether bitter melon extracts can slow the growth of certain cancer cells, including breast cancer cells, in cell culture experiments, but that kind of preliminary laboratory finding is a long way from evidence that eating bitter melon prevents or treats cancer in an actual person. The honest answer, across every one of these health claims, sits somewhere between the enthusiastic folk legend and the confident supplement label, and it is considerably more complicated than either one wants to admit. There is also a side to this plant's story that rarely makes it into the wellness marketing at all. Bitter melon is not risk-free. Medical case reports describe hypoglycemic coma and seizures in children after ingesting parts of the plant, particularly the seeds and the red aril that surrounds them. Those seeds contain a compound called vicine, which can trigger a reaction similar to favism, a hemolytic blood condition, in people who are deficient in an enzyme called glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase. At least one published case report describes a child's death after ingesting the red covering around the seeds. Other case reports in the medical literature have linked bitter melon intake to an irregular heart rhythm called atrial fibrillation and to episodes of acute kidney injury in adults who consumed concentrated extracts or herbal preparations containing the plant. Medical references consistently warn against its use during pregnancy, since animal studies suggest it may raise the risk of birth defects and could act as an abortifacient at higher doses. For people already taking insulin or other blood sugar lowering medication, bitter melon can compound those effects and increase the real risk of dangerously low blood sugar, which is precisely why several clinical guidelines recommend close monitoring for anyone combining the two. So the same intense bitterness that healers across 3 continents once prized as a sign of medicinal power is also, quite literally, a chemical warning sign worth taking seriously in both directions, and worth discussing with a doctor rather than assuming from tradition alone. Reviews of liver safety data have found no clear link between bitter melon and liver injury in humans, which offers some reassurance, but researchers are careful to note that safety data overall remains limited compared to how widely the plant is actually used around the world, which brings the story back to something much closer to home. That knobby, pale green or deep-ridged vegetable sitting in the international aisle of an ordinary grocery store or steeping as a dark, bitter tea in a mug on someone's kitchen counter carries all of this history inside it. It carries a disputed prehistoric journey out of Africa, one that geneticists are still actively arguing about. It carries thousands of years of Sanskrit medical tradition from the Indian subcontinent. It carries a Ming dynasty physician's careful 27-year notes from 4 centuries ago. It carries the memory of enslaved and immigrant communities who kept the plant alive across oceans, under new names, in new kitchens, on islands far from either Africa or Asia. And it carries a modern scientific debate, still unresolved right now, about how much of its ancient healing reputation actually holds up under a controlled clinical trial. Millions of households across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean still cook with it or brew it every single week, most of them with no reference to any of these studies at all, simply continuing a habit passed down from a parent or a grandparent. Today, the plant is grown commercially across the Amazon, Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, and increasingly in South America and the southern United States, wherever the climate is warm enough to support it. In American cities with large Asian or Caribbean immigrant populations, bitter melon has moved well beyond specialty markets, now showing up in the produce section of ordinary supermarket chains alongside cucumbers and zucchini. The supplement version of the plant has followed a similar path, moving from small herbal shops into mainstream pharmacy shelves, sold in capsule form at doses typically ranging from about 500 to 1,000 milligrams, taken 2 or 3 times daily according to standard product labeling. The next time this vegetable shows up on a dinner plate, in a stir-fry, a curry, or a cup of bitter tea, it is worth remembering that its story is far older, far stranger, and far less settled than the label on any supplement bottle would ever suggest. If this kind of hidden food history is something you want more of, subscribe to keep these stories coming. And down in the comments, tell me which part of bitter melon's past surprised you the most, or which everyday food or ingredient you want this channel to dig into next.